So Justin, you recently had 2 trips to Sweden where you were able to look at how the Swedish Air Force does its dispersal and their operations. And I recently had a visit as well. And I think we're both quite impressed with what they're managing to do. Could you give a brief overview of the Swedish model and then talk about whether that's a realistic option for most European countries?
Yeah, the Swedish model it's undeniably impressive, even though by their own kind of account they would say that they've let a lot of the core skills atrophy a bit. Their basic model is that they would have, I think it's 5 main operating or sort of home operating bases, and then they have forward operating bases, 13 additional ones, and then they have 20-something reserve bases, and then they have highway strips as well. And this is for a force of about 100 fast jets, so it's not an enormous force. Quite a few of those main and reserve and forward bases are bases with multiple runways, so it doesn't just have the main kind of runway or runways. There are additional dispersal runways, kind of a set distance away in various different alignments, often kind of as part of highways or in trees, but all connected up to the main base by multiple taxiways, so that even if you had some of them cratered, aircraft can still move between them and operate. Which also just means that their bases in general occupy a large area, so it's not just about being able to disperse the aircraft between bases, it's also being able to disperse them on the base. You can move aircraft between different hard stands, different areas, different shelters, and so anyone who attacks any one of their bases individually is likely to get a really very limited number of aircraft with any given number of missile strikes. You would have to, it becomes quite quickly a fairly non-viable target set, given the cost of the long-range fires that Russia would have to be using. That is cruise or ballistic missiles, which are, Russia has in the low thousands of, but they are expensive, and as they're finding in Ukraine, they can't be produced particularly quickly, and so they have to be relatively careful about what they use them on. The Swedish model relies on, if they are concerned about an attack or have warning, or just they're exercising, they will disperse their main fighter wings out to various dispersal locations in relatively small groups with mobile maintenance teams for servicing, for aircraft turnaround, rearming, refueling, everything in vehicles, so they have a range of vehicles within each wing. It's very impressive, the kind of core maintenance and tooling set and spares kits for a Gripen are delivered and kind of live in their main hangars on their main bases in 20-foot shipping containers that sort of plug into the side of the building, as it were, rather like trucks at a kind of supermarket distribution centre or something. They sort of reverse onto into the side of the hangar and become part of it at that point, but can then be quickly moved. And so because all the tools live in the shipping containers anyway, it's very, very quick and easy to just put those things on trucks and move them out. And then mobile teams can do the refueling, rearming, and all the protection and air traffic control and fire and rescue and everything else from vehicles in these dispersed locations for extended periods of time if they need to. That also necessitates training their crews in a very different way from the way most European air forces, or indeed global air forces, train, because it implies a very high level of responsibility and mission complexity in terms of briefing as well and planning as well as flying. In particular, also potentially planning and replanning sorties at short notice in complex mission areas with limited communications and limited support crews. So even 2 ship leads or 4 ship leads have to be very, very capable. And as such, the Swedish Air Force doesn't have a tour system, for example, where in a lot of European air forces like in the RAF, or in the US Air Force for that matter, fast jet crews will do typically 3 years on a tour. Now they might do a couple of tours with a squadron, but typically they might move between squadrons, between bases, get experience in different roles. They may do ground tours or tours, for example, as a forward air controller or that kind of thing, and then come back to flying as a squadron commander maybe, or later as a wing commander. Whereas in the Swedish system, you join a fighter wing and you're expected to be there for 20 to 25 years. You're not expected to move, you're expected to put down roots, and essentially your career, primarily speaking, is with the squadron, or at least within the wing, which has a couple of squadrons typically. And so they have the luxury, therefore, of having this much more kind of in-depth and focused training package that goes over a decade to move up to where 2 ship leads might be 3 years in, for example, 4 ship leads maybe 6 years in if you're good. You might be trained as a 4 ship lead. Whereas compared to, say, the RAF or the US Air Force, 4 ship lead you might be expecting perhaps in your 2nd or 3rd year on squadron. And maybe even at that point, if you're very good, starting to train as a weapons instructor, which is sort of the store of tactical knowledge and and combat leadership, essentially, and expertise in weapon system employment and tactics. Whereas in the Swedish system, you don't start even being looked at as a potential weapons instructor or mission commander until you've been on a wing about 10 years. So it's this much slower, more in-depth progression, and they all do air-to-air to start with, and then kind of broaden that speciality once they're combat-ready air-to-air. But it results in an extremely flexible, adaptable fighter force that can do genuinely complex, high-intensity mission sets from a really dispersed posture with this decentralized kind of tactical command and control. At the same time, it's then quite vulnerable to personnel disruption, for example. So if you lose a bunch of people who retire early, or you're struggling for retention, then of course it takes much longer to potentially make good on that loss, or that under provision of trained pilots, because it takes you so much longer to train people to the standard you need. The Finnish Air Force, interestingly, who operate American aircraft, so the F-18 at the moment, and are buying F-35, they also operate a dispersed model, not quite as kind of radically dispersible in theory, although they practice it more than the Swedes. But they also don't operate a tour system in the way that NATO air forces do. They also see it necessary to kind of have people on squadron for 15, 20 years and really train them up quite slowly so that they can do take off from one dispersed base in a 2-ship or a 4-ship, go meet up, concentrate rapidly with a bunch of other aircraft, do something really complicated, land somewhere, refuel, rearm, replan on the fly, go up and do it again, and do things like beyond visual range combat with 4 ships in total instrument meteorological conditions, so sort of blind flying in 10 tenths cloud in ice in the Arctic. So it's a really in-depth skill set. Could you do that in other European air forces? Yes and no. There's a degree to which you could certainly radically improve the ability of European air forces to operate dispersed by changing procedures, permissions, practices, tactics, and particularly kind of cultural attitudes to risk. So things like watching the Swedes when I was up in the Arctic with them, doing rearming and refueling of aircraft, in some cases with the engine still running, by the side of a dispersal strip with teams of 6, 5 of whom are conscripts with 2 or 3 months training, winching up and down the weapons, refueling the aircraft, certifying it all to go with one highly skilled, 3 or 4 year minimum trained technician just supervising it. The permissions and the kind of authorizations to be required to do that, and who would hold the kind of risk that a system like the German system or the British system would perceive in that. There's nothing technically stopping us doing that, but it would be a huge cultural shift to enable us to move that way. Equally, particularly for the Swedes who have built the Gripen from the ground up to operate like this, it's much easier to maintain particularly with quite limited tool sets. Things like all the panels pop off with kind of all the significant access panels you need are easily reachable without a ladder while walking around on the ground, even if you're relatively short. With gloves on, you can still pop the panels off and do what you need to do. You can't retrofit that sort of design and things like a high capacity auxiliary power unit to be able to do a lot of cold start requirements without auxiliary power if you need to. That kind of has to be designed into your aircraft from the beginning if you want to do that. So there are limitations to what NATO standard air forces in Europe can accomplish, but we could certainly get a lot better than we currently are. The flip side is it will be more expensive, and it will take more pilot and ground crew and force protection capacity to conduct basic training if we're training to fight dispersed. Because the reason we've all, as European Air Forces, gone concentrated is to save money. It's to be close to a centralized, industrially enabled and provided maintenance solution with as many aircraft as possible right next to your kind of base of industrial support and spares and maintenance. Often deep maintenance facility, industrial deep maintenance facility co-located with your main bases. And lots of wings all concentrated there, so you also have fewer bases to run, fewer bases to provide security for, upkeep for, personnel at, accommodation to run, all of that stuff. There's a reason why these air forces have shrunk over the years since the end of the Cold War, but that reason is definitely not making them less vulnerable to attack. It's been about maintaining a given size of front line for less money. And the basic uncomfortable truth of a lot of stuff around dispersal is, yes, we could make a lot of progress going back to it. Yes, you could maybe improve by 20 or 30% in a lot of air forces just with a more mature attitude to risk. And to kind of looking at what the actual operational requirements are versus what we've always done or what people have experienced during their careers. But a lot of it is a case of you're just going to have to stop doing other activity to afford to spend more on your core business. Or if you want to keep doing your current level of activity but do it dispersed, spend more money.
Big thank you to Patreons and channel members for your support. Without you, this sort of content would not be possible. If you want to support this channel and the videos that I make, do check out the support options in the description below. Signing up as a Patreon or channel member, you get exclusive bonuses, and right now we are also crowdfunding a filming trip over in the US, and you can earn some exclusive perks there as well. Big thank you to Professor Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute for his insights, and as always, I wish all you legends a great day and see you in the sky.